The secret of reaping the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest enjoyment from life is to live dangerously. Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born on the 15th of October 1844 in the small Prussian village of Roken near Leipzig. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was a Lutheran pastor, and his mother, Franziska, came from a long line of Protestant clergymen. The young Friedrich grew up in a household steeped in religious piety, moral strictness, and the expectation that he too would follow in his father's footsteps. But fate had other plans. When Nietzsche was only 4 years old, his father died suddenly from a brain illness, leaving the family shattered. Within months, his younger brother also died. These early encounters with death and suffering left an indelible mark on the boy's soul. Raised in a household of women, his mother, grandmother, 2 aunts, and sister Nietzsche grew up sensitive, introspective, and acutely aware of life's fragility. He excelled in his studies, particularly in classical philology, the study of ancient Greek and Roman texts. By the age of 24, before he had even completed his doctorate, he was appointed as a professor at the University of Basel in Switzerland, an almost unprecedented achievement. His colleagues marveled at his brilliance, his mastery of ancient languages, and his ability to see connections others missed. But beneath this academic success, something was stirring. Nietzsche was beginning to question everything he had been taught about life, morality, and the human condition. His early work, The Birth of Tragedy, challenged the prevailing understanding of ancient Greece. Scholars had long portrayed Greek culture as the pinnacle of rationality, harmony, and beauty, the Apollonian ideal of order and light. But Nietzsche saw something else. He saw that Greek tragedy emerged from a tension between 2 opposing forces: the Apollonian drive for order, clarity, and individuation, and the Dionysian drive for chaos, ecstasy, and dissolution of boundaries. The Greeks, he argued, were not simply rational beings who happened to produce beautiful art. They were people who stared into the abyss of existence, who felt the terror and meaninglessness of life, and who created art and myth as a way to make that terror bearable. They did not turn away from suffering, they transformed it into something beautiful and life-affirming. This insight would become central to everything Nietzsche wrote. He saw that modern European civilization had lost touch with this Dionysian spirit. Christianity, with its emphasis on sin, guilt, and other worldly salvation, had taught people to despise the body, to flee from suffering, and to seek comfort in the promise of eternal peace. The Enlightenment, with its faith in reason and progress, had promised that humanity could solve all its problems through science and rational thought. But what had these movements actually achieved? They had created what Nietzsche called the herd, masses of people who lived comfortable, mediocre lives, who followed the same values, who sought the same small pleasures, and who had lost the capacity for greatness, for suffering, and for becoming something more than human. Nietzsche himself lived anything but a comfortable life. From his 20s onward, he suffered from debilitating health problems, severe headaches, digestive issues, near blindness, and what he called the great pain. He was forced to resign from his professorship at Basel after only 10 years due to his failing health. He spent the next decade wandering through Europe, Switzerland, Italy, France, and Germany, living in cheap boarding houses, subsisting on a small pension, and largely isolated from human contact. He would wake in the middle of the night, vomiting from the pain, unable to read or write for days at a time. Yet during these years of intense suffering, he produced his greatest works, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, On the Genealogy of Morals, The Antichrist, and Ecce Homo. There is something profoundly paradoxical about this. The man who wrote about the affirmation of life, about dancing and laughter, and about saying yes to existence, was himself trapped in a body that betrayed him daily. He had few friends, no romantic relationships, no stable home, and no recognition during his lifetime. His books sold poorly. His ideas were misunderstood or ignored. He was lonely, ill, and increasingly isolated. And yet, from this crucible of suffering, He forged a philosophy that would shake the foundations of Western thought. How is this possible? Because Nietzsche understood something we have forgotten, that meaning is not found in the absence of suffering, but in suffering for something worth suffering for. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche's prophet figure descends from his mountain cave after 10 years of solitude. He has grown weary of his wisdom, which has accumulated like honey in a hive with no one to receive it. The sun, he notices, would be nothing without those it shines upon its light and needs the earth to give it meaning. So too, Zarathustra must descend to share his wisdom with humanity, to awaken them from their comfortable slumber. But what he finds in the town below horrifies him. The people have become what he calls the last man, creatures who have invented happiness and blink at the notion. They say, "We have discovered happiness," and they are pleased with themselves. They have made everything small, comfortable, and mediocre. They avoid anything difficult, anything that might disturb their peace. They have forgotten what it means to be human. The last man represents the endpoint of a civilization that is optimized for comfort, safety, and the avoidance of suffering. He works a little and rests a little. He has as little pleasure for the day and as little pleasure for the night, but he has a regard for health. He no longer knows what it means to create, to strive, or to overcome. He looks at those who lived dangerously, who pursued greatness, who were willing to suffer for their ideals, and he finds them strange, even contemptible. "We have discovered happiness," he says again, blinking in contentment. And Zarathustra despairs because he sees that humanity has chosen comfort over becoming, safety over aliveness, and the warm bed over the cold mountain peak. This image of the last man haunts our contemporary world. Look around and you will see him everywhere. He is the person scrolling endlessly through social media, seeking stimulation but finding only emptiness. He is the person who works at a job he despises because it provides security, who dreams of something more but never risks anything to achieve it. He is the person who medicates every discomfort, boredom with entertainment, anxiety with pills, loneliness with pornography, and restlessness with shopping. He has solved the problem of immediate suffering by creating a life so insulated from difficulty that nothing can touch him. But in doing so, he has also insulated himself from meaning, from growth, and from the very things that make life worth living. The great psychologist Carl Jung encountered this same phenomenon in his clinical practice. His patients were not, for the most part, suffering from trauma or mental illness in the classical sense. They were suffering from what he called neurosis, a dis-ease of the soul that arises when the conscious personality is at odds with the unconscious depths. Many of his patients were successful by worldly standards. They had good jobs, stable relationships, and comfortable lives. And yet they felt empty, purposeless, as if they were sleepwalking through existence. Jung came to understand that neurosis is not simply a psychological problem, it is a spiritual problem. It is the cry of the soul for meaning, for growth, for the realization of one's deepest potential. Jung wrote extensively about the process he called individuation, the journey of becoming who you truly are, of integrating the conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche into a unified whole. This is not a comfortable process. It requires descending into what Jung called the shadow, the repressed, rejected, denied aspects of ourselves that we have pushed into the unconscious. It requires facing our fears, our inadequacies, and our destructive patterns. It requires what the alchemists called mortificatio, a death of the ego, a dissolution of our carefully constructed identity. Only through this death can a rebirth occur. Only by confronting what we have avoided can we become whole. The alchemists understood this process deeply. Their great work, the Opus Magnum, was ostensibly about transforming base metals into gold, but any serious student of alchemy knows that this was a symbolic language for inner transformation. The prima materia, the base matter from which the work begins, is the unexamined life, the unconscious personality, and the raw material of the psyche. The process of transformation requires heat, suffering, difficulty, and the friction of life's challenges. Through repeated cycles of solution, coagulation, calcinatio, which means burning, and other operations, the material is gradually purified, refined, and elevated. The final product, the lapis philosophorum, or philosopher's stone, represents the self, the integrated, individuated personality that has realized its potential. But modern life short-circuits this process at every turn. We have invented 1,000 ways to avoid the heat, to escape the dissolution, and to remain in our comfortable base state. We numb ourselves with substances, alcohol, drugs, and prescription medications. We distract ourselves with endless entertainment, television, social media, and video games. We busy ourselves with trivial tasks, convincing ourselves that productivity equals meaning. We surround ourselves with people who never challenge us, who reinforce our existing beliefs, and who never force us to question who we are or what we're doing. We build lives of such elaborate comfort that we never have to face ourselves. And what is the result? An epidemic of meaninglessness. Despite living in the most materially prosperous civilization in human history, rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide continue to rise. Young people report feeling lost and purposeless, as if life is a burden rather than a gift. Middle-aged people experience what has been called the midlife crisis, a sudden realization that the life they've been living is not the life they were meant to live, that they have been asleep, that decades have passed, and they have not truly lived at all. The elderly, looking back on their lives, feel not satisfaction but regret. Regret for risks not taken, words not spoken, and dreams not pursued. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, writing a generation before Nietzsche, diagnosed this condition with remarkable precision. He distinguished between 3 stages, or spheres, of existence. The first is the aesthetic stage, the life devoted to pleasure, novelty, and the avoidance of boredom. The aesthetic person moves from one experience to another, seeking stimulation, never committing deeply to anything. He is what Kierkegaard calls a rotation method practitioner, constantly rotating through new pleasures to avoid the staleness of repetition. But this leads inevitably to despair, because no amount of pleasure can fill the void of meaninglessness. The second stage is the ethical stage, the life devoted to duty, responsibility, and moral principles. The ethical person commits to a career, a marriage, and a set of values. He lives according to universal moral laws, playing his role in society. This is more meaningful than the aesthetic life, but it too has its limitations. The ethical person lives according to external standards, following rules handed down by society, never truly encountering his own unique existence. He is what Heidegger would later call inauthentic, living as they live, thinking as they think, never asking whether this is truly his path. The third stage is the religious stage, not religious in the sense of institutional religion, but religious in the sense of absolute commitment to something beyond oneself, a leap of faith into the unknown. This is the realm of the knight of faith, who has passed through the aesthetic and ethical stages and arrived at something higher. The knight of faith looks like anyone else. He goes about his daily business, performs his duties, and enjoys simple pleasures, but inwardly, he has made the movement of infinity. He has surrendered his will to something greater, accepting that his life is not his own, that he is part of a larger pattern he cannot fully comprehend. This is terrifying. It requires giving up the illusion of control, the comfort of certainty, and the safety of the known. Most people never reach this stage. They remain stuck in the aesthetic or ethical realms, seeking comfort and security, never making the leap. And this, for Kierkegaard, is the greatest tragedy, not that we suffer, but that we live lives of quiet desperation, as Thoreau would later put it, lives we have not chosen. Lives we endure rather than embrace. Nietzsche saw this same pattern, but approached it from a different angle. For him, the problem was not simply that people avoided the religious stage, it was that Christianity itself had become a religion of comfort, of escape, of resentment against life. He traced the genealogy of morals back to what he called the slave revolt in morality. In ancient aristocratic societies, values were determined by the strong, the noble, and the life-affirming. Good meant powerful, healthy, beautiful, and proud. Bad meant weak, sick, ugly, base. But Christianity, he argued, inverted these values. It made weakness into virtue, suffering into nobility, and humility into goodness. It taught people to despise their bodies, their desires, and their natural instincts. It promised them that the meek would inherit the earth, that the last would be first, and that suffering in this world would be rewarded in the next. This was, for Nietzsche, a masterstroke of psychological revenge by those who could not compete in the realm of physical strength and worldly power. Unable to affirm life as it is, unable to create their own values, they created a moral system that turned their weakness into strength, their failure into success, and their resentment into righteousness. They said the strong are evil, the proud are sinful, and the healthy are corrupt. Blessed are the poor, the meek, and the persecuted. This world is fallen, corrupt, and meaningless. True life begins only after death. Thus Christianity became, in Nietzsche's famous phrase, a Platonism for the people, a way of devaluing this world in favor of an imagined perfect world beyond. The consequences of this inversion are still with us. We have inherited Christianity's suspicion of the body, even as we have lost faith in the soul. We have inherited its promise of comfort and safety, even as we have lost belief in heaven. We are left with a culture that teaches us to avoid suffering at all costs, but offers no transcendent meaning to justify that avoidance. We are, as Nietzsche declared, living in the age of nihilism, not because we have chosen meaninglessness, but because the old sources of meaning have collapsed, and we have not yet created new ones. Nietzsche's famous declaration, "God is dead," is often misunderstood. He was not celebrating this fact, he was announcing a catastrophe. God, in this context, represents the entire framework of transcendent values, moral absolutes, and cosmic meaning that had structured Western civilization for 2 millennia. With the rise of science, rationalism, and skepticism, this framework had become untenable for thinking people. They could no longer believe in divine providence, eternal judgment, or a cosmic order. But what happens when the scaffolding of meaning collapses? Most people do not notice immediately. They continue living by Christian moral values, compassion, equality, humility, without acknowledging that these values no longer have any foundation. They have killed God, but continue to act as if he is alive. This is the condition Nietzsche calls nihilism, living in a world without meaning, but not yet having the courage to create new meaning. And the danger of nihilism is not simply despair or depression. It is the slide into what Nietzsche calls passive nihilism, the exhausted desire for nothing, for rest, for escape. Passive nihilism seeks comfort, distraction, and the cessation of all striving. It is the nihilism of the last man, who has given up on greatness and settled for pleasant mediocrity. This is the real danger of our age, not that we will destroy ourselves in a cataclysm, but that we will fade away in comfort, becoming so domesticated, so tame, so small, that we lose the capacity for anything great. Against this, Nietzsche proposes what he calls active nihilism, the willingness to destroy the old values in order to create new ones. This requires tremendous courage. It means standing alone, without the comfort of tradition or the security of universal moral laws. It means becoming what he calls the Übermensch, the overman, the one who overcomes. Not overcome in the sense of dominating others, but overcome in the sense of self-overcoming, continually surpassing oneself, never settling into a fixed identity. The Übermensch does not ask, what does society value, or what does God command? He asks, what do I value? What meaning will I create? This is not solipsism or egoism. Nietzsche is not advocating for a world in which everyone pursues their own pleasure without regard for others. Rather, he is calling for individuals to take responsibility for their own existence, to stop outsourcing meaning to external authorities, and to become legislators of their own values. This is terrifying because it removes all safety nets. There is no one to tell you what is right, no cosmic insurance policy, and no guarantee that your suffering has meaning. You must create that meaning yourself. The existentialists of the 20th century, Sartre, Camus, and Heidegger, would develop these themes further. Sartre famously declared that existence precedes essence. We are not born with a predetermined nature or purpose. We must create ourselves through our choices. This freedom is experienced as anguish because it means we are radically responsible for who we become. We cannot blame our parents, our society, or our circumstances. We are, in Sartre's phrase, condemned to be free. Camus approached the problem through the lens of the absurd. We long for meaning, for coherence, for answers to ultimate questions. But the universe is silent. It offers no explanations, no justifications, and no comfort. This confrontation between our need for meaning and the world's indifference is what Camus calls the absurd. Most people, faced with this realization, choose either philosophical suicide retreating into comforting illusions, religious faith, or ideologies that promise meaning, or physical suicide, giving up entirely. But Camus proposes a third option, revolt. We can acknowledge the absurdity of existence and choose to live anyway, to create meaning in defiance of meaninglessness, to imagine Sisyphus happy as he rolls his boulder up the mountain for eternity. This image of Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to an eternity of futile labor, resonates deeply with Nietzsche's philosophy. Sisyphus could despair, his task is meaningless, his effort wasted, his situation hopeless. But Camus suggests that in the descent back down the mountain, Sisyphus is free. He is conscious of his absurd task, and yet, he continues, he has not been broken by the gods. He has not sought escape in illusion or death. He has said yes to his fate. This is what Nietzsche calls amor fati, the love of fate, the willingness to embrace everything that happens to us, including suffering, as necessary parts of our becoming. But to understand why comfort is so dangerous, we must understand what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is not simply our dark side. It is everything about ourselves that we have rejected, denied, or repressed because it does not fit our self-image. For someone raised to be good, polite, and agreeable, the shadow might contain anger, selfishness, and destructive impulses. For someone who identifies as rational and controlled, the shadow might contain wild emotions, irrational desires, and chaotic creativity. The shadow is that which we cannot admit to being, and so we push it down into the unconscious. But the shadow does not disappear. It continues to influence us from below the surface of consciousness, erupting in unexpected ways, a sudden rage, an inexplicable attraction, a self-destructive behavior that seems to come from nowhere. Or, more commonly, we project the shadow onto others. We see in other people the qualities we cannot acknowledge in ourselves. The person who rants about sexual immorality is often wrestling with their own repressed desires. The person who obsessively criticizes others for laziness is often avoiding their own lack of authentic ambition. The person who sees evil everywhere is often fleeing from their own capacity for cruelty. The path of individuation requires confronting the shadow, acknowledging that we contain everything, light and dark, good and evil, creation and destruction. This is deeply uncomfortable. It means admitting that we are not who we thought we were, that our self-image is a carefully constructed illusion, and that we are far more complex, contradictory, and capable of both great good and great harm than we would like to believe. Most people refuse this confrontation. They prefer to remain comfortable in their partial self-knowledge, projecting their shadow onto enemies, scapegoats, and outsiders. But this refusal has consequences. Jung observed that what we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate. The unlived life, the parts of ourselves we have rejected, does not simply vanish. It shapes our destiny from the shadows, drawing us into situations that force us to confront what we have avoided. The man who refuses to acknowledge his anger will find himself in relationships that provoke his rage. The woman who denies her need for solitude will find herself overwhelmed by obligations. The person who rejects their creative impulses will feel a gnawing emptiness no amount of success can fill. In mythology and fairy tales, this pattern appears again and again. The hero must descend into the underworld, face the dragon, and enter the dark forest. This is not metaphor, it is psychological reality. The underworld is the unconscious, the dragon is the shadow, and the dark forest is the territory of the unknown. The hero's journey is the journey of individuation, and it cannot be accomplished from the safety of the village. One must leave the known world, venture into danger, and face what one has been avoiding. Only then can the treasure be won, the princess rescued, and the kingdom restored. But our culture has forgotten how to tell these stories. Our modern narratives are often about comfort, about protagonists who are already good and right being validated by the world. We want heroes who never doubt, who never fail, and who never have to truly change. We want happy endings without the painful middle. We want the reward without the ordeal. And so we produce a generation that does not know how to suffer meaningfully, that interprets all difficulty as injustice, all discomfort as trauma, and all challenge as oppression. This is what Jung means when he says that neurosis is a substitute for legitimate suffering. When we refuse to suffer consciously to face our shadow, to confront our limitations, to endure the death and rebirth of transformation, we suffer unconsciously instead. We develop symptoms: anxiety, depression, addiction, psychosomatic illness. These symptoms are not the enemy, they are messages from the unconscious, desperate attempts by the psyche to get our attention, to tell us that something is wrong, that we are living inauthentically, that we have lost our way. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's closest collaborator, once said, "A depression is a blessing of God. It is the greatest blessing somebody can have." Jung always talked about the blessing of a neurosis because it is the only way you are tempted to look within. As long as things go well, you run away from yourself. This is a shocking statement to modern ears. We have been taught that depression is purely a brain chemistry problem, to be fixed with medication, and certainly, in severe cases, medication can be necessary and helpful. But von Franz is pointing to something deeper, that often depression is the soul's way of saying no to a life that is not being truly lived. It is a refusal to continue pretending, a collapse of the false self we have constructed. The false self is what Donald Winnicott called the compliant self, the persona we develop to please others, to fit in, to be acceptable. It is the self that has learned to say the right things, to perform the expected roles, and to suppress anything that might cause conflict or discomfort. For many people, the false self becomes so developed, so convincing, that they forget there is anything else. They become identified with their roles, the good employee, the devoted parent, the responsible citizen, and lose touch with their authentic desires, feelings, and needs. But the true self cannot be suppressed forever. It makes itself known through what James Hillman calls pathology, the breakdowns, the symptoms, the moments when the carefully constructed life falls apart. Hillman writes, "Our pathologies are calls from the gods. The gods, in this context, are the archetypal forces of the psyche: love, power, creativity, destruction, wisdom, and madness. When we refuse to honor these forces, when we try to live according to purely rational, controlled, comfortable principles, they take their revenge. Aphrodite scorned brings obsessive sexual compulsion. Ares' denial brings explosive rage. Dionysus rejected brings addiction and self-destruction. The gods will be honored one way or another. This is why comfort is so dangerous. It allows us to avoid the gods, to ignore their calls, and to live in a narrow, flattened, merely human existence. We think we are being reasonable, mature, and realistic. We think we have transcended the primitive superstitions of our ancestors. But we have only driven the gods underground, where they fester and grow monstrous. Then we are surprised when we find ourselves doing things we cannot explain, feeling things we cannot control, and trapped in patterns we cannot break. We have forgotten that we are not simply conscious egos, rational agents making optimal choices. We are vast, complex beings, shaped by forces far older and deeper than our conscious thoughts. The ancient mystery religions understood this. The Eleusinian mysteries, the Dionysian rites, and the Orphic initiations, these were not quaint cultural practices. They were technologies for transformation, ways of inducing altered states of consciousness in which initiates could encounter the gods directly, experience death and rebirth, and return transformed. The initiates of Eleusis would drink the kykeon, a psychoactive potion, and descend into the underground temple. There, in darkness and terror, they would experience visions of death, the underworld, and finally, rebirth. Those who went through this initiation said they no longer feared death. They had experienced something beyond the ordinary world, something that gave them unshakable conviction about the reality of the soul. We have lost access to these transformative experiences. Modern life is designed to keep us in ordinary consciousness, focused on practical tasks, economic productivity, and comfortable routines. We are suspicious of altered states, of mystical experiences, of anything that cannot be measured and controlled. And so we remain trapped in what William Blake called single vision, the purely material, rational understanding of reality. We see the world as dead matter, to be exploited for our comfort and convenience. We see ourselves as isolated egos, competing for resources and status. We see life as a problem to be solved, rather than a mystery to be lived. But there have always been individuals who break free from this limited vision. The mystics, the artists, the madmen, those who have ventured beyond the comfortable boundaries of conventional consciousness and returned with reports from the other side. Meister Eckhart, the medieval Christian mystic, spoke of becoming so empty of self that God could work through you, of achieving what he called Gelassenheit releasement, letting go, and the surrender of the ego's frantic grasping. The Sufi poet Rumi wrote of the necessity of dying before you die, of allowing your false self to be burned away so your true self could emerge. The Buddhist meditation masters speak of the dark night of the soul, the period of intense suffering and disorientation that precedes awakening. All of these traditions point to the same truth. Transformation is not comfortable. It requires descent before ascent, dissolution before reconstruction, and death before rebirth. The caterpillar does not become a butterfly by making itself more comfortable. It enters the chrysalis, where its body completely liquefies, where it ceases to be a caterpillar without yet being a butterfly. It exists for a time in a state of pure potential, formless, neither one thing nor another. Only through this complete dissolution can the new form emerge. Modern psychology has forgotten this. We want to help people feel better without asking whether feeling better is really the goal. We medicate sadness, pathologize grief, and treat any deviation from comfortable normalcy as a disorder to be corrected. But what if some of what we call depression is actually the beginning of transformation? What if the breakdown of the old self is necessary for the emergence of the new? What if the dark night of the soul is not a problem to be fixed, but a passage to be endured? Nietzsche himself went through such a passage. In January 1889, in Turin, Italy, he suffered a complete mental breakdown from which he would never recover. The exact cause remains debated, perhaps tertiary syphilis, perhaps a brain tumor, perhaps a stroke. But the symbolism is striking. For 11 years, he had pushed himself beyond human limits, writing in a white heat of creativity despite constant pain and illness. He had said yes to life with such intensity that perhaps his mortal frame could not contain it. In his last lucid days, he wrote letters signed Dionysus, or the Crucified One, identifying himself with the god of ecstasy and the god of suffering. Then, he collapsed on a street in Turin, reportedly throwing his arms around the neck of a beaten horse and weeping. He never wrote again. He spent the last 11 years of his life in the care of his mother and sister, largely unaware of his surroundings, the fire of his genius extinguished. There is something profoundly tragic about this ending. The man who wrote about self-overcoming, about the will to power, and about becoming who you are, was reduced to a state of infantile dependency. His sister, Elizabeth, who had always disapproved of his philosophy, took control of his literary estate and began systematically distorting his work to align with her nationalist and anti-Semitic views, the very opposite of what Nietzsche stood for. His books, which had sold barely at all during his productive life, began to be widely read after his breakdown, but were often misunderstood and misappropriated. The Nazis would later claim him as a philosophical ancestor, despite the fact that Nietzsche despised German nationalism and anti-Semitism. But perhaps there was also something fitting about Nietzsche's fate. He had written about the necessity of suffering, about saying yes even to the worst aspects of existence. He had asked whether one could affirm life so completely that one would choose to live it again, exactly as it was, for all eternity, what he called the thought of eternal recurrence. Could Nietzsche say yes even to his own breakdown, to the destruction of his conscious self, to becoming a living embodiment of the tragedy he had written about? We cannot know. But we can recognize that he lived what he taught, that he did not seek comfort or safety, and that he burned himself out in service of his vision. What, then, are we to do? How are we to live in a world that constantly offers us comfort, that promises us we can avoid all suffering, and that tells us we deserve ease and pleasure and security? The answer is not to seek out suffering for its own sake, that would be mere masochism, as futile as hedonism. Rather, the answer is to choose a path worth suffering for, to align ourselves with something greater than our own comfort, and to say yes to the difficulty of becoming. This might mean pursuing a vocation that calls to you despite financial insecurity. It might mean confronting painful truths about yourself that you have been avoiding. It might mean leaving relationships that feel safe but dead and risking the unknown. It might mean creating something art, a business, a family, knowing that the process will break you open and remake you. It might mean simply choosing, each day, the harder path, the steeper climb, the greater challenge, not because it will make you happy in the moment, but because it will make you more fully yourself. Jung wrote about this in his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. He described a period of tremendous inner turmoil following his break with Freud, when he felt lost, directionless, and overwhelmed by visions and dreams he could not understand. He could have retreated into the safety of his psychiatric practice, maintaining a comfortable professional life. Instead, he chose to descend into what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. For several years, he deliberately induced altered states, recorded his visions, and engaged with the figures that appeared in his inner world. This was dangerous, he feared. He was going mad. But he trusted that there was meaning in the chaos, that the psyche knew what it was doing, and that the dissolution of his conscious orientation was necessary for something new to emerge. From this descent came everything that followed his theories of archetypes, the collective unconscious, individuation, synchronicity, and the self. All of his most important work grew from his willingness to endure those years of confusion and suffering. He wrote, "The years when I was pursuing my inner images were the most important in my life. In them everything essential was decided. It all began then. The later details are only supplements and clarifications of the material that burst forth from the unconscious, and at first swamped me. It was the prima materia for a lifetime's work." The prima materia, the base matter from which the alchemical work begins. This is where we all start, confused, fragmented, and identified with our ego, our social role, and our comfortable routines. The work of transformation requires us to descend into this raw material, to dissolve the false structures we have built, and to face what we have been avoiding. Only then can something genuine emerge. Only then can we begin to live authentically from our own center rather than from external expectations and comfortable habits. Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence can serve as a test for this authenticity. Imagine that you will live your life over and over again, exactly as it is, for all eternity. Every moment, the joyful and the painful, the meaningful and the trivial, the noble and the shameful, will repeat infinitely. Can you say yes to that? Can you embrace your life so completely that you would choose to live it again and again, without change? Most of us would recoil from this thought. There are too many regrets, too many moments we wish we could erase, and too much of our life that feels like wasted time, like mere endurance, rather than genuine living. But this horror is itself instructive. It reveals that we are not living lives we truly affirm, that we are tolerating existence rather than embracing it, that we are waiting for retirement, for the weekend, for the pain to stop, for life to finally begin. We are not here, not now, not fully present in the only moment we actually have. We are lost in regret about the past or anxiety about the future, never inhabiting the present with full consciousness. The antidote to this condition is what the Germans call Augenblick, the blink of an eye, the eternal moment, the now that contains all time. When we are fully present, fully engaged, and fully alive, time changes its quality. Hours pass like minutes. We lose ourselves in the activity, in the moment, in the flow of existence. This is what Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi calls flow, the state of optimal experience in which we are challenged at the edge of our abilities, neither bored nor overwhelmed, and completely absorbed in what we are doing. This is when we feel most alive, most ourselves, and most real. But modern life is designed to prevent flow, to keep us in a state of comfortable distraction. We are overfed and understimulated, overstimulated and undernourished, and simultaneously bored and anxious. We have so many options that we can never choose, so much information that we can never integrate it, so many connections that we feel more alone than ever. We live in what the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman calls liquid modernity, a world where everything solid melts into air, where all commitments are temporary, and where nothing can be counted on to last. This creates a pervasive sense of groundlessness, of having nowhere to stand, nothing to hold on to. In such a world, the choice to commit to a path, a person, a place, a practice, is itself an act of rebellion. It is a refusal of the liquid modern mandate to keep all options open, to never fully invest, and to always hedge one's bets. It is a recognition that depth requires narrowness, that mastery requires repetition, that love requires vulnerability, and that meaning requires sacrifice. You cannot become excellent at everything, so you must choose. You cannot love everyone, so you must commit. You cannot live everywhere, so you must root yourself somewhere. These choices feel like losses, and they are, but they are also the only path to genuine fulfillment. Nietzsche wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." This is perhaps his most important insight. When we have a purpose great enough, we can endure extraordinary suffering. Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz and went on to found logotherapy, observed the same pattern in the concentration camps. Those who survived were not necessarily the physically strongest or the most well-fed. They were those who had a reason to live, a loved one they hoped to see again, a work they needed to complete, a meaning they refused to relinquish. The camps stripped away everything external: family, possessions, dignity, even names. But they could not strip away the one thing that remained uniquely human, the freedom to choose one's attitude, to find meaning even in suffering. This is the final answer to the question of comfort. Comfort is not the goal of life. Meaning is the goal. And meaning is forged in the crucible of difficulty, in the gap between what we are and what we aspire to become, in the struggle to realize our potential despite obstacles. When we optimize our lives for comfort, we inadvertently optimize them for meaninglessness. We remove the very friction that produces the pearl, the very resistance that builds strength, and the very suffering that deepens the soul. The great paradox is that the pursuit of happiness leads to misery, while the pursuit of meaning leads to fulfillment, which includes happiness, but as a byproduct rather than a goal. When we chase pleasure, it eludes us. When we flee from pain, it pursues us. When we build our lives around avoiding discomfort, we create lives so fragile that even minor difficulties feel catastrophic. But when we choose a path worth walking, regardless of comfort, when we commit to something greater than ourselves, when we say yes to the full catastrophe of human existence, then we discover a strange alchemy. Suffering transforms into meaning, difficulty into growth, and pain into wisdom. This is what Nietzsche meant by the Übermensch, not a genetically superior being, not a tyrant or a Superman in the comic book sense, but simply a human who has overcome the human, all too human tendency to choose comfort over becoming, safety over aliveness, and the warm bed over the cold mountain. The Übermensch has passed through nihilism and emerged on the other side, capable of creating values rather than merely inheriting them, capable of affirming life rather than merely enduring it, capable of dancing on the edge of the abyss rather than cowering in the comfortable valley below. We stand at a threshold. Behind us lies the world of tradition, of inherited meaning, of God and objective values, and cosmic order, a world that no longer holds for most of us, a scaffolding that has collapsed. Before us lies the unknown, the territory we must map ourselves, the values we must create, and the meaning we must forge from the raw material of existence. Most people, faced with this threshold, retreat. They cling to the ruins of the old world or distract themselves with comfortable mediocrity, never crossing into the new. But a few, choose to step forward into the darkness, trusting that there is something worth finding there, even if they cannot yet name it. This is the path Nietzsche walked, and the path he calls us to walk. It is not easy. It is not comfortable. It promises nothing except the opportunity to become who you truly are, to live with authenticity and intensity, and to say yes to existence without reservation. Most will refuse this call. They will choose the warm bed, the steady job, the safe relationship, and the comfortable routine. They will optimize their lives for the avoidance of suffering and wonder why they feel so empty. They will reach the end of their days and realize they never truly lived, never took the risk, and never found out who they might have become. But you who have read this far, you who feel the stirring of something within you, have a choice. You can return to comfort, to the life you have been living, to the slow death of never becoming. Or you can step forward into difficulty, into the unknown, into the fire that forges souls. The choice is yours. It has always been yours. And it is a choice you make not once, but every moment of every day, in 1,000 small decisions that accumulate into a life. Choose wisely, or rather, choose dangerously. Choose the path that terrifies you, that calls to you, that promises nothing but the opportunity to become. For in the end, that is all any of us have, the chance to say yes to our own becoming, to affirm this brief, strange, terrible, beautiful existence, to live as if our lives mattered because we chose to make them matter. The secret of reaping the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest enjoyment from life is to live dangerously. Build your cities on the slopes of Vesuvius. Send your ships into uncharted seas. Live at war with your peers and yourselves. Be robbers and conquerors, as long as you cannot be rulers and possessors, you seekers of knowledge. The time will soon be past when you could be content to live hidden in forests like timid deer. At long last, the pursuit of knowledge will reach out for its due. It will want to rule and possess, and you with it.